Hello, and welcome to our informative webinar on the impact of COVID on the mental well-being of our teens and insight into what teens need to do well. My name is Sharon, and I am the chapter leader of Parents for Children's Mental Health in the Waterloo region. PCMH is a provincial nonprofit believing that youth and their families suffering with mental health challenges deserve our extreme respect and assurance. We provide families with direct knowledge and resources to navigate the mental health systems, as well as offering monthly support groups and one-on-one support. I have the pleasure of introducing today's presenters. Susan Gross is a school and clinical psychologist currently connected with a number of schools in the region. She has been at the school board since 2008, and prior to that worked out of Grand River Hospital outpatient mental health. She also has private practice work in the community of Guelph. Susan has a particular interest in child development and considering what is just normal development. Rather than considering what has gone awry or what might be wrong with the child, she finds it helpful to look at their challenges or behaviors through a lens of what they need to do well. She prefers a positive and strengths-based perspective rather than a deficit, mental illness-based model, as she is interested in looking at ways to promote and further resilience, strengths, and well-being within our youth and in our community of family and educators supporting our youth. Through her work, she has continually been impressed by the critical role of connection and relationships for well-being, our children's and our own. Rainey Reddy is a practicing psychologist working for the Waterloo Region School Board, and she runs her own private practice in Ancaster. She was a high school biology teacher before venturing into the field of psychology. Rainey prioritizes mental health and well-being in youth, currently working on implementing SEL in high schools as a means of promoting mental health, equity, and inclusive practices. Growing up in an apartheid society drives her passion for equity-related work. In her current work, Rainey describes that there is a coming together of her background in biology, psychology, her spiritual practices, and her life experience. Angela Sider has been a family engagement specialist in the Waterloo region. Today, she is here sharing her insights, wearing her mom hat, and sharing from that perspective. Meredith Hutton is a teen mental wellness advocate. She is passionate about advocating for the struggles of youth. She uses her own lived experience and her involvement in many youth activism groups to find her voice. Her Instagram bio states, "I'm just a 16-year-old getting real and cutting the BS." Now, let's get to the reason why you are attending.
Thank you, Sharon, for that introduction. And first of all, thank you all listening for inviting us and giving us this opportunity to explore this question with you today about the impact of COVID-19 on the mental well-being, the mental health of our teens, and what they need from us. How can we help? When I was first asked by a parent group to consider this question, I hoped it would help me as I considered how to best support families, teachers, and teens I worked with day to day in my job, but more personally to consider how my own household of teens were faring relative to others and how I might ensure we as a family might, if not thrive, at least survive. So if you're viewing this presentation as a parent, a grandparent, an educator, or maybe as a teen, whoever you are, I want to acknowledge your commitment as we reflect on this pandemic journey together. I'm truly grateful and honored to spend some time this evening to consider this question with all of you. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today is the land traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We also acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. I always resonate with the image of birds flying in formation, so this artwork by Leah Dorian, a Métis artist from Saskatchewan, spoke to me, particularly as we come together as a school board, community partners, educators, and parents to consider this topic. So let's walk through our map for our time together. Before we begin in earnest, my colleague Rani has graciously offered to help ground and center us with an experiential exercise to bring us together into this virtual space with intention and presence. Then we'll be breaking the time up into two parts of this question. How has the pandemic impacted our youth? What we hear in the news and what the ongoing surveys are telling us, and acknowledging our own feelings of worry for our kids and our families. As I explored and reviewed this question, I worried it would all be rather hopeless, but I've really been so encouraged by the many stories of how teens are doing well despite the challenges. So I want to explore what it means to be resilient and how we can nurture this in our youth. Secondly, I'll be using what we know about teen development to not only consider why this pandemic has been so challenging for our youth, but also to consider what they need to continue developing in normal ways despite the pandemic and to be resilient in the face of it. And as we go along, we'll also be hearing some reflections from both a parent perspective and a teen perspective, thanks to Angela and Meredith. I also want to add how much I appreciate their input. As when I put these thoughts together, I hope that they would resonate with other parents as they did for me. But most of all, I hope that they represented an authentic perspective of what teens were experiencing and what they would in fact find helpful. So I'm really humbled and grateful for their ideas, their contributions, and most of all, their validation. And I think you will be as well. I'll pass this over to Rani now.
Okay. It's my pleasure being here today. Susan's put together a great presentation based on research and lots of pragmatic information aided by Angela and Meredith. So you're in for a treat. I'm going to begin with an experiential exercise. Listen to your body as we move through this exercise. Experiential exercises is not everybody's cup of tea. This exercise has its origins in mindfulness practices. So let's take a moment to offer acknowledgement and gratitude to the ancient cultures from which mindfulness and meditative practices originate. Although we adapt and use these practices for our own purposes, it is encouraged that we do so with reverence for its origins and with respect for it. This is a coming into presence exercise. It's a practice that can bring a renewed sense of assurance and our capacity for wise and resilient action. So please start where you are, wherever that may be. Orientate to your environment, noticing features of your external world. The room you're in, the shape of the furniture in the room, perhaps the colors of the walls or the art on the walls, the sounds around you, maybe the sounds of the TV or the birds chirping in the background. Noticing all you can about your external environment. Shift your attention to your internal world. Noticing and naming states of mind, feelings, and thoughts as they come to your awareness. Perhaps annoyance at answering an email, anticipation of the day ahead, or a sense of wishing away struggles. Noticing as much as you can about your internal world. Now, eyes closed or softly open, let your awareness drop below these conscious events to a deep inner awareness of being here in the present moment. Focus attention on your body sensations, your feet on the ground, your back against the chair, and become aware of your awareness to body sensations. Shift your attention to your breathing. the breath gently flowing in and out. Become aware of your awareness to breathing. And as the awareness to breathing deepens, the mind quiets and the chatter stops or recedes to the background. You can drop into a sense of being here, in this moment, into a steady sense of simple presence. This moment, this breath, here and now. This present moment, this present breath. This precious moment, this precious breath. Let your awareness come to rest in a steady inner peace of being rather than doing. Stay in the sense of steady presence for as long as you can, even if it is for a few seconds at first. A sense of spaciousness, a stillness, or a sweetness is a reliable marker that you are present. Take a moment to notice any shifts in your consciousness as you come to that stillness, that quiet of mind that allows you to access and listen deeply to the wisdom of your own true nature. Please bring your attention back to the presence of this presentation, and I invite you to capture moments of coming into presence during the presentation and throughout your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Rani. I hope that that was as grounding for the listeners as it was to me as we proceed with this maybe kind of heavy topic, and as we try to ground ourselves in our nature as caring caregivers. So thank you, Rani. Since the beginning of this pandemic, health and mental health professionals have been observing and trying to understand the impact on all of us at different stages of this ongoing global situation, and as we progressed together through the many different waves of it. And what we very quickly learned is that no one is not affected in some way. However, we also quickly learned that some of us are impacted in very different ways and disproportionately affected based on age, previous health, income, gender, and race. So as this excerpt from a poem and visual demonstrates so well, we may be in the same storm, but we may be in different boats. And I would add that as this pandemic has extended over time, we may feel like we've moved from one boat to another, depending on how we are managing at any given time. I think Meredith has an example that she'd like to share.
So I collected a bunch of stories and examples of the youth experience over this pandemic from just fellow youth in the community from different schools. So I want to start off by one that I found personally really impactful and that I related to as well. So they said, things were going well until the new year came in. Being in person half the time was something I thought I was going to really enjoy, but I quickly realized how little determination I had for schooling and academics in general. Being in isolation for so long, as well, even if it was just partial, made me have trouble feeling comfortable to speak my mind in crowds, even just the size of the classrooms. This was odd to me because I was previously a very outgoing person in those groups. I always had something to say, and these events had me worried. Not being able to speak in groups, not being able to work as hard as I used to when it came to school started morphing into other issues like stress eating and a lot of denial about what I was feeling.
Thank you, Meredith. I think that probably resonates so well with so many of our teens and so many of the teens that I spoke with as well. So as parents, I know we are concerned about our kids. It's been challenging to watch them navigate all the news, the detours and losses throughout this year, and some of those examples that were referenced as well, while we ourselves are just trying to figure it all out. And it's not just COVID that our youth are managing, but also their regular and normal goals of just learning who they are and how they want to be in the world, where they want to be, and who they want to be with. And if that isn't enough, then add on the layers of social inequities highlighted so clearly by this pandemic and reinforced by the coinciding Black Lives Matter movement, and our society's ongoing awareness of systemic injustices toward Indigenous peoples, the hidden history of which was highlighted again by the finding of those 215 First Nations children in a mass unmarked grave in BC just recently. So whether our teens have experienced any of this directly or indirectly, and how communities are managing this or not managing as they witness ongoing conflicts in the world, as they watch protests and divides in the US, as they worry about our governments ignoring the call from those lost Indigenous children, or heed the call for climate change, or even just witnessing our own communities' grumblings about masks and restrictions and vaccines. And then layered on all of this for any of us is that ever-present sense of self-judgment, negative self-talk. Am I doing any of this right? Why is everyone else seeming to do better than me? And then that increasing sense of shame that can pile on as well. Plus, it feels like it's just not ending, and it's easy to lose steam and lose hope. So naturally, we're worried because we know that stress becomes toxic when it is frequent, prolonged, and uncontrolled. And we know that living in a prolonged state of uncertainty and stress, anxiety about health, schooling, social relationships, feeling not in control, can create challenges and can eventually make it more difficult to learn. I think many of us can relate to this as we struggle to feel productive at work. And as the student in Meredith's example explained, just that lack of motivation and determination that was felt as well. A student of mine called it a case of the Joneses just recently. Linked here is a really helpful short YouTube you can look at on your own time, describing what happens when the brain is pushed into survival mode. And then we constantly hear on the news what health officials, physicians, and studies have been sharing and arguing about, which seems to just confirm our concerns and fears that the pandemic is having a significant impact on our youth. And as these quotes warn us, the impacts will be felt for years and decades to come, creating the possibility of a COVID generation. Recent news stories and articles in our own community papers and talk shows worry about the rise in anxiety for our youth and lament how will they catch up at school. I included this slide not to depress us, but to acknowledge that we're being inundated with these scary and negative stories on a daily basis, as are our kids. And because media wants to get our attention, it's of course the sensational and alarmist news that gets the most play, which serves to raise our alarm bells all the more. So even if we think we're doing fine, the news raises our stress level that maybe we're missing something. Maybe it will get even worse. Maybe we won't recover from this. So I wanted to recognize and validate that this is also part of our and our teenagers' daily experience. I know this is why so many of us appreciated the efforts of actor John Krasinski as he created the YouTube Some Good News to share the many positives and the human connections and victories that have also been happening through this pandemic. Check it out if you haven't already. So the emergent story of how our youth are doing is based on imperfect information. So it really depends on what you look at and how they gathered their data. And remember that this story is still evolving and that there is no one story as youth are experiencing these events through their own contexts and experiences. But some findings that have been consistent from survey data as well as anecdotally do reveal some concerns. Educators and parents worry about lost learning, and even more so the lost connection of students to school, particularly those who are vulnerable in the first place. Educators have watched many of their students check out over the year and the many transitions as it became harder and harder for them to feel like part of a school community. And then as learning became harder and harder, they felt increasingly disconnected and ashamed. As many youth became less connected and had fewer supports and opportunities for others to monitor how they're doing, pediatricians report that they're seeing younger and more patients for depression and anxiety. Crisis lines saw an exponential increase in calls as youth were reaching out with their concerns about the illness, their own well-being, and despair about the future. Emergency rooms saw an increase in self-harm cases. A spike has been seen in eating disorders, substance use, as well as weight gain, online gaming, and decrease in exercise. And as parents, you've been noticing changes in your children, perhaps, in their behavior, mood, sleeping, or eating patterns. These concerns show me that youth are feeling distressed and, frankly, are trying to find ways to cope with this feeling. So although we do want to get to how to best support what our students need during these times, it wouldn't be prudent to not also share some signs of mental struggles that we should as caregivers be aware of and learn to recognize in our children. Because we know that early identification and intervention is important. And we also know that during these disrupted times, some of the concerns our students are experiencing might be missed and accessing the right resources might be challenging. So remember, for a mental illness to be diagnosed of depression or anxiety or sleep or eating disorder, the health professional needs to see that the symptoms are persisting beyond what might be considered typical. It's normal to feel loss, frustration, worry, and even to develop different and maybe less helpful habits of eating or sleeping poorly. But it's when these symptoms persist for more days than not and have a significant impact on functioning and being able to go about the normal business of living that we do define them as disorders. So when we feel something is not right with our child, we do want to pay attention to this and check in as to how they're doing. Sometimes we're afraid to open up sadness, but asking them if they're feeling sad won't make them sad. Asking them if they've thought of hurting themselves won't make them think of hurting themselves. Sometimes we're afraid to see and hear that they're not doing well because of our own worries for them and our own fears that we might not know how to help them. But sometimes the most important thing we can do is to pay attention, notice, and truly listen to how they're doing and feeling. And we may not know what to do or say in the moment, but we can allow them to feel heard, to feel validated, and important, to not feel alone. To help consider how our youth are doing, we can also look at risk factors. Looking at how teenagers cope in natural disasters and traumatic events has shed light on a number of risk factors that might make some youth more vulnerable than others. With the additional challenges of COVID and all that it entails, youth who may have been struggling before, perhaps with a mental health diagnosis or undiagnosed concerns, might be less able to use their normal coping skills that were helping them to get by before. Youth who have had more direct experience losing someone to COVID may struggle more than those who just hear about it. Youth who have a caregiver who is also suffering with a mental health or illness or addiction and may not be available to them in the same way. Also, when a family is struggling more in general, there may be challenges in relationships, conflicts, general instability around housing or basic needs. So adding these additional stressors may push a family's coping capacity beyond what they can typically manage, creating even greater instability and conflict. And the other area that's been highlighted by the pandemic are the inequities amongst students and families. Those in vulnerable and disadvantaged communities that had already experienced barriers to education and health supports, those experiencing racism bias, and those with parents as healthcare and essential workers all report to be feeling more distress and less able to access some of the resources that could support them. But with that in mind, let's not forget there are also protective factors. Research on how youth cope show that generally youth are resilient. We're generally wired to find ways to cope and adapt. And it's really important to recognize that youth have lots of factors that protect and mitigate the impact of these risks for them. These are only a few, such as having accurate and reliable information from credible sources, so they can feel they can truly understand what's happening and what they can do about it and have a little more sense of control. Having access to supports and resources. And even if they don't seem to use these supports, just perceiving they have access to resources is protective. And having some sense of control helps youth feel less overwhelmed. And having a temperament that's generally positive and hopeful. And if that isn't one's temperament, it is something that can be modeled in practice. So while we want to acknowledge and pay attention to signs of this pandemic impacting our youth's mental health, we also want to look further at some of these protective factors. And part of what we're going to look at today is how to shore up these factors. So let's look at some of the survey data about the impact on our youth. As I noted, a number of surveys and studies have been done locally and around the world trying to understand and follow the real impact of this pandemic on different age groups and specifically on youth and their families. Again, depending on what studies you look at which age groups and how they collect their data, and when during the pandemic they ask their questions, the impact seems to vary. I've seen anywhere from 14 to 50% of youth indicating that their mental health was impacted. For our purposes today, I wanted to share this more recent survey from Statistics Canada conducted last September with this very specific age group of youth aged 12 to 17, which shows about 14%, or 1.4 out of every 10 youth, said that their mental health was worse than a year earlier. What's important to recognize is that another 60%, or 6 out of 10 youth, describe their mental health as roughly the same. This likely doesn't mean they didn't feel frustration or stress, but they did not report any significant sense of ongoing challenge or mental distress. And what's really encouraging from this research is that about 1/4, or 26% of youth, said that they were actually doing better and were experiencing positive impacts from the pandemic. Some are appreciating the slowdown and being with their family. Some are feeling reduced social pressures. So we know that as this pandemic has ebbed and flowed across the year, teens have been and are continuing to be impacted, some in negative ways, and some less so, and some even in positive ways. And we won't really know for a long time how much influence developing through this time will have on our youth. What we do know is that big events that happen in adolescence tend to be the most formative for their values and priorities, for worse or for better. Growing up during this time can't help but have an influence. I'm going to turn it over to Meredith to provide an example.
I hope that this example gives some parents a sense of hope. I know that it truly inspired me. This person said they got into eating really well, practicing mindfulness, doing all sorts of things to keep them in the moment and not lost in all the tragedy that they really had no control over. I didn't know who to talk to, but I did some research and thinking, and I realized that the best thing for me to get better was to practice better habits. My parents played a big role in this without even realizing it, supporting me trying new things and allowing me to find what really ended up working for me. All I needed was to get back on the horse, as some would say. I ate better, I planned my meals. My dad was happy to add new things to the grocery list. My parents drove me to my friends' houses and let me stay up late nights talking to them because they knew that that was only when we were able to both find a time to talk. These were all game changers for me as a student and as a kid still trying to find my way. The support from my parents, my own motivation, and self-reflection are really what made the difference.
What a great story of navigating through a difficult year. Thanks, Meredith. So as parents and caregivers, no wonder we've been worried about our youth, and that's why we're here together now. This quote is from a Globe and Mail article back in the winter, outlining some of the impact on Canadian teens, reflecting on how teens have been faring and why we're worried. The journalist says, in a year of uncertainty, threat, and stress, teenagers have been ordered really, to perform the largest gesture of collective altruism in recent history, at great personal cost, with the least say in the matter, and at one of the most important stages of their social and mental development. This was supposed to be their time to launch into the world, but then the world closed down. Some teens have been resilient, but others have had worsening mental health problems, and the long-term effects in their lives may not be clear for a long time. So no wonder we're worried about them. So while we know that many of our youth are experiencing struggles, and we want to ensure that we recognize if they're drifting into any serious mental health concerns, we also want to balance this with what is normal coping and allow responses that, although they might show that they're stressed, they also show that they're simply trying to cope and navigate through this time. The author in this attached article offers us a reminder not to pathologize our normal human responses to hard situations. Struggling to cope with the pandemic is not a matter of mental illness in itself. It is just that, struggling to cope. struggling to cope with these many changes, with doing school differently, with missing our friends, with real worries about getting sick or loved ones getting sick, and just being tired of things not feeling familiar and safe and not knowing when it will be over. School Mental Health Ontario has been monitoring how our students are doing, and on balance are seeing our students as not experiencing any more disorder than pre-pandemic. That is, there has not been an increase in diagnosed mental health disorders, but there has been an increase in feelings of distress. And that says to me that youth are being stretched in their ability to manage. And it also says to me that those changes in eating patterns, sleeping patterns, mood and behaviors are all their attempts to struggle to cope. And sometimes they're doing okay, and sometimes they're not. And as we've been learning about and paying attention to our varied responses to this pandemic, I've noticed different kinds of language and frameworks being used for this. When we were first trying to understand people's reactions and responses, I noticed that we were using the words trauma, wondering if everyone would experience some level of PTSD once this was over. Trauma is often defined as the experience of an event or of an ongoing situation as unbearable, as creating a sense of vulnerability that is too much to bear and feels beyond one's control and beyond one's ability to cope. And to be fair, some in our society will experience this time as trauma. But for the most of us, as the shock of the pandemic settled in and became more prolonged, I noticed some of this language has shifted to grief and grieving. There have been many losses to grieve. Some have lost loved ones to the illness. Others experienced the loss of missing each other and missing events, recitals, grads, gatherings, and for youth, a sense of loss of this time in their life that they just won't get back. And the normal reaction of grief is to deny, to feel angry, sad, and then for most of us, to just keep on moving forward. Seeing this as grief also, I think, helps to normalize it. It is normal to feel anxious. And as one researcher put it, if you aren't feeling anxious, you aren't paying attention. And it is normal to feel sad about this. So understanding how we're doing from this grief lens also helps us see how the very restrictions in place to keep us healthy have denied our collective grieving, at least in person. Often when we grieve something that we share with others, we do this together within ceremonies and memorials. We share our sadness, and thus we share our values, which strengthens our community and helps us build something out of that loss. So in any way we can, it actually really helps to talk about what we've lost and missed out on, to bring this solitary process out into the open. I notice this happening simply in the repetitive conversations about how we're doing, because really, what else is there to talk about? But it is because it is something we're all experiencing, and there is value in that sharing. So in our present pandemic challenge, how can we acknowledge the struggles and losses our teens are experiencing and allow them to feel their normal responses of frustration, worry, and grieving, and also support our youth to continue to cope and mitigate the risk to their mental well-being? What we're talking about is how to nurture their resilience. As we study how people cope with challenges, we've come to learn that a big factor that contributes to mental health is one's resilience. And indeed, you might have noticed that resilience has in fact become one of the buzzwords of this pandemic, maybe along with pivot, unprecedented, the new normal, or the most annoying phrase to me, you're on mute. But what I think is really important is to talk about how we can do resilience together. As psychology professor Stephen Riker's written about, rather than talking about individual frailty or how poorly any of us might be feeling or managing, instead we can talk about collective resilience, and then how we can move from collectively grieving what we've lost to supporting each other to be resilient and get through this. So let's break down a bit what resilience is and what it is not. To help us do this, I'll share the work of Dr. Michael Unger, founder and director of the Resilience Research Center at Dalhousie, who studies resilience all around the world and has a really helpful way of presenting what he's learned. He asks us to imagine a seesaw, that old play equipment no longer in the playgrounds. So first, picture a balanced seesaw. Dr. Unger points out that during normal situations, the stresses we experience may stack on one side, but the resources we have to help us be resilient are balanced out on the other side. And that most of the time, we have enough resilience to help us be flexible and to adapt and cope and keep that seesaw relatively balanced. During a crisis, our capacity to cope is overwhelmed, but eventually the balance is able to return and we adapt. So picture the seesaw dropping down on one side, but then coming back to balance. During a pandemic, he suggests, we stack the seesaw on the stress side. We might be potentially under-resourced in our normal ways of coping. Maybe income, less social contact, less routine. So the seesaw gets stuck in that unbalanced position. And I can't then help but think about the little me at the top of the seesaw, legs swinging, not knowing when my seesaw partner might jump on, I would be slammed down on my bottom. Just that feeling of helplessness and uncertainty. Unger's research also noted that resilience is not just about one's individual resources. We hear a lot about one's individual grit or smarts, when it really depends more on what we receive than what we have. It's more about knowing we can access the right resources around us and receiving them at the right time and given in the right way to help balance out that seesaw once again. Another of my favorite psychologists in resilience is Dr. Robin Hanley Defoe from Trent. She defines being resilient as we are okay during a setback, challenge, or a crisis, and we are okay on the other side of it. How we get to and stay okay varies, but it's the practice of continuing to push forward, even when it's hard. She reminds us that resiliency lives within us all. She also says that the only difference between those who can keep getting up after adversity and those who struggle with it is knowing how to draw on this resource in times of need. And another important element that she emphasizes in her definition is that this can be taught, this can be modeled, and this can be practiced, which I'll get into more later. So resilience does not mean toughening up, not crying, soldiering on, stiff upper lip. Resilience does involve emotions, and it can involve anger and tears, lying in bed one day and saying, I can't do this. It certainly can involve asking for help and not feeling weak, but being realistic. Resilience is more about steering through adversity, moment by moment, and learning from it. Some talk about resilience as bouncing back, but frankly, feeling bouncy and peppy when I'm struggling and sad isn't always possible or realistic. So it's really more about being able to continue to function relatively normally, to be okay in adversity and despite adversity. And it does involve being able to seek out and make use of the resources you have, asking for help, creating new ones. And as Unger describes, when those stresses and resources are in some kind of balance. It does include dialing down that inner critic, that inner judgmental voice we all have that tells us we should be doing better. We don't have it as bad as some people. And then piling shame and guilt on top of our challenges. And it does involve showing yourself sufficient self-compassion to let yourself feel what you're feeling and know you're worth the time and attention to get through this. So knowing about resilience, our question becomes, how can we nurture and teach resilience in our youth as they cope with these current stressors so that they are and they can stay okay? I'm going to pass it over to Angela to share an example as well.
Yeah, I know it's really challenging. Thank you, Susan. It's really challenging to be a parent during this time. One of the examples that I oftentimes share around my daughter and resilience is she, at the very beginning of the pandemic, actually did really quite well. The adjustment to not being in school created some opportunities for her to be able to do better and cope better. Initially, we experienced an increase in some challenges as time went on, and I think the duration of the pandemic has worn many of us down. And the new phrase pandemic fatigue or lockdown fatigue has kind of come up, and I think that that's taken a toll on my daughter as well, where it's gotten more difficult to focus on school, to be able to I guess just deal with kind of the everyday challenges. And as parents, we've had to be really flexible and adaptable to be able to create kind of the safe space for her to adjust how she needs to in order to still be able to cope. Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I can so relate, and I think a lot of our listeners will as well. So let's move on to the second part of our presentation as we keep those thoughts in mind and consider this question of how to nurture our teens' resilience in the face of these challenges. But it also begs the question of why are youth especially vulnerable? What's happening at this developmental time that makes the pandemic especially hard on them? Why are many of our youth being challenged to be resilient? In trying to answer these questions, I've scoured the research, news articles, and opinion pieces where writers are trying to consider this topic. And so far, I've found that many of the reasons why seem to coalesce around a few basic ideas. And I came to a recognition that I actually found reassuring, that we just need to use what we already know about teens and teen development. And we also have to learn to listen to and trust our teens. I was inspired by writings by psychiatrist Dan Siegel, who talks about some of the vital aspects of being an adolescent. I enjoy his writings because he normalizes and celebrates this developmental time. He describes the myths of adolescence, those things we tell ourselves about teens that are often negative. They're so dramatic, they're so impulsive, they don't think about the impact on others, they're not motivated. Siegel explores what more recent neuroscience tells us about this, and he challenges the prejudice that youth are difficult, but in fact are developing and acting normal, which may have both downsides and upsides, and may make managing through this time particularly challenging. Using this perspective, it becomes clearer that teens might just be doing what they need to be doing and doing it the best they can with what they have. But as that earlier Globe and Mail quote suggested, one of the difficult aspects of how this pandemic is impacting youth is that it becomes obvious that many of the safety measures and restrictions in place to mitigate the illness sometimes work directly against and come into direct conflict with those normal developmental goals of teenagers. So over the next several slides, we're going to dive deeper into these reasons why, to break down what I've identified as 4 normal developmental phases of youth development. We'll go through the downsides and the upsides of each of these very typical expectations and the reasons around why COVID may have impacted this. I hope that by knowing a bit more about what might be making this pandemic so impactful on our youth might allow us to step back and consider what they need from us and what they especially need now to navigate this period in their lives, to mitigate the challenges this pandemic is placing on them and help them be resilient and continue to develop and grow. Franz Unger's research on resilience also tells us that how well any of us do is not a measure of what individuals bring to the situation, but how well others provide us with what we need to survive and thrive. That is, it's not about our kids having or not having the right stuff to get through this, but how well we can meet their needs and help them use all that they do have. So number 1, the first of these reasons or normal developmental stages has to do with the ongoing brain development our teens are experiencing. Teens are still in the midst of developing their frontal lobes, where more executive functioning happens. And brain science shows us that development really goes on until their early 20s. So they have a long way to go yet. So the first impact of this to consider is that our teens' frontal lobes, where reasoning happens, is not always linked with their emotional processing. So they're still learning how to regulate their emotional reactions. And secondly, teen brains are still developing the capacity for flexible thinking. Their ability to think flexibly and consider an organized, planful response and to consider different identities for themselves is not well developed or well practiced yet. You have to remember that emotions and reasoning skills reside in different parts of the brain. And in teenagers where these executive skills aren't yet fully developed, these parts of their brain are not yet communicating and coordinating well enough to regulate their emotions with thinking, with using the coping skills they might have learned, or what they learned from the last time they felt this way. As adults, our brains have developed greater ability to make sense of information and balance our emotional response by putting it into perspective with what we know from past experiences. Adults also have greater capacity to think flexibly, to consider things from different angles, and see alternative ways to accomplish our goals. And we've had more experiences to practice these skills and just try out different ways of being, finding out that it really can be okay even if it's not as we planned. So the downside of this for teens is their inconsistent ability to regulate their emotions, resulting in mood swings, resulting in them often presenting as reactive, explosive, dramatic, and headstrong, even when they don't mean to. Teens also tend to see the world as black and white and have trouble shifting from one mindset or way of looking at things to another perspective, making them seem stubborn and headstrong. But they might be trying to seek control for things that aren't always controllable, as they just can't see another way to do things. The upside is that teenagers have a powerful passion to live life fully, to capture life in the moment. They have ideas and they commit to them, often passionately. Why this is hard comes from some obvious reasons that we can all relate to. The social isolation experienced within this pandemic might be especially difficult for teens to make sense of and to manage emotionally, causing them to feel anxious, frustrated, and alone. This pandemic has created so much upheaval. From one week to the next, all of us are asked to do things differently. And as pointed out in that earlier news article, Teenagers are in the unique position of being the ones most affected by the lockdown measures, but with the least amount of control over the decisions being made. Not to mention the additional challenges of how schools needed to structure themselves this year. Who knew we'd have to restart school 3 times across the year? On one hand, some kids thrived with the additional structure in place, but all kids really missed the outlets of the non-academic parts of school too. The clubs, the sports, the volunteer opportunities, and just seeing other kids. And particularly at high schools with the challenge of the quadmesters, which made learning so fast-paced, there was never time to consolidate learning through reflection and practice. And as an insightful high school team I work with recently pointed out, in May and June, just when kids are typically starting to shut down and lose energy and motivation, we're asking them to start with a whole new subject. So we know that many youth and many of us might be experiencing emotional challenges from one day to the next. One way or another, this prolonged global crisis we're all living through can't help but have an emotional impact. As Angela mentioned, we've heard it called COVID fatigue. Every day I hear someone say, "I'm just so tired of this. I'm just so done." A New York Times writer recently reflected on how we're managing this emotional long haul of the pandemic, which he described as languishing, or the absence of well-being, the opposite of flourishing. Many of the youth who are struggling more in this pandemic are struggling to manage many of these emotions. And that leads us to the next point here of how hard it has become to be flexible in the face of these challenges, to continue to find new ways to cope with this sense of languishing, to find new ways to spend their time, to manage things looking and being different. This is one of the biggest conversations I hear in my schools right now and with friends regarding their kids, that everyone's just tired and losing motivation and having trouble engaging in activities that normally wouldn't be hard for them, or thinking of new ways to do something or different ways to do something, leading again to that cycle of feeling incompetent and overwhelmed and feeling shame. A really important aspect of being able to cope and be resilient is our ability to be flexible in our thinking and in our identity and how we see ourselves. If a young person had seen herself as a hockey player, someone who got respect and praise from each hockey game, and that was taken away, where does she now spend her time? And most importantly, where does she get her sense of self-esteem? Or if they were a music student who was looking forward to expanding their sense of themselves as creative and maybe finally getting noticed for things they did well, and these opportunities became limited, where will that identity come from? Many of our kids are challenged in their ability to be flexible, not only in what they could do, but how they do things, and also in how they see themselves. I think both Angela and Meredith are going to provide an example. If you want to go first.
I can go first. Sure, I can go first. One of the things that comes to mind is a little bit around kind of the black and white thinking that you talked about, Susan. And I know one of the things that my daughter had as a bit of a routine was she would come home from school, which obviously it looks different now, but she would come home from school and take that time to connect with me, debrief kind of about her day, talk through situations that she kind of came up with. Oftentimes it was friend related, those kinds of things. And what I found with the lockdown and the kids being out of school was that time changed. And I had to adapt to be flexible because she wasn't necessarily able to be as flexible. So for her, that time changed and became later in the evening. So she would come into my room later in the evening, want to talk about all kinds of things that kind of were going on for her. Sometimes it were times when I was, really should have been sleeping or in bed, but I would definitely be flexible to give her the time. And I think that was partly because she couldn't necessarily cope in a way that was maybe fit already with kind of our structure or our schedule. And so we had to adapt and respond to her needs. So definitely there's that that black and white piece around this is kind of the way things needed to be. And so as parents, we definitely were the ones that had to be flexible and had to adapt when and where she couldn't.
Thank you, Angela. I've heard a lot of teens in the community and even in myself express how some of the terminology that parents can use to comfort us may actually be more harmful than good. And I know it's hard to know what's right, and sometimes it can feel like you can never say the right thing. But I feel like this teen example was really enlightening. And they said that when I expressed my struggles to trusted adults in my life, most of them responded with, "I understand," or "I get how difficult that is." But that only made me more frustrated because they don't get it. Maybe instead of saying something like, "I get it," or "I understand," you could say, "I can't imagine how hard this is for you," or "Do you want to tell me more about what that experience feels like for you?"
Thank you, Angela and Meredith. And Meredith, that leads us right into knowing this, what do our kids need from us and how can we better support them? First of all, to help regulate their emotions, they need to feel truly understood and to feel safe, to express and navigate all of these feelings, even the less pleasant ones. Right now, they might be feeling a lot of sadness, grief, loss, and frustration, but they might also be feeling shame and judgment for how they're struggling. So how can we then help them feel safe and accepted and heard in the midst of all this emotional turmoil? It's really important to simply be there for our kids and be truly present, both physically and emotionally. And I recognize this is not always easy. As Angela says, sometimes it's just time for bed. And it takes self-compassion for ourselves as parents, especially since we have a lot that distracts us, our own work stress, our own concerns about the illness. So we need to show compassion for ourselves first if we're to truly show up for our youth. One really important thing we can do is, as Meredith said, to listen to our youth. Again, this isn't as easy as it sounds, and we won't always say or do the right things, but that letting them know it's okay to be stressed and stressed out. Normalizing these feelings. Yeah, this sucks. It's hard. And helping them grieve the loss of this broken and upside down year. And remembering, as Meredith said, that accepting feelings isn't the same as fully understanding them. Our kids know we can't truly get what this is like for them, but we can be curious about what it is like and show that we care about what they're experiencing, and they will appreciate that. And being understanding when our child is upset or angry or not wanting to comply with the rules, letting them know their feelings, their worry, their anger, their boredom are okay and normal to feel. And you're there to help them figure out maybe a better way to respond to those feelings. We can also think about how we model coping. Parents set the tone in the household. As much as we'd like to think that all of our words of wisdom make the difference, we teach more to our children through our example than our words. The way we react to situations often speaks volumes to our children. So model how you're coping with changes and managing your feelings about them. And model the messaging that although this is hard, it is temporary and a brighter future does lie ahead. Once we're calm, we are then able to lend our calm to our children. Sometimes we can't expect them to be able to calm down in the moment. And it's easy to get pulled into their stress, partly because we're also tired and partly because we hate seeing them so distressed. And then we feel helpless ourselves. So getting back to that self-compassion, we need to care for ourselves so we can model and lend that calm to our kids. Because what we've come to understand more recently about this topic of self-regulation is that we are not independent beings. We regulate ourselves best when we co-regulate and can find that calm together. And we can continue to offer and help our children build tools and coping strategies and learn skills to regulate their emotions and worries. One way is by practicing paying attention to positive emotions. The natural default of the brain is negativity. So to counteract this default, we need to practice paying attention to things that are working in our life in an intentional way. So is there a way we can add this to our interactions with our kids? Noticing and asking them what's going well. What are they grateful for? What are they proud of? And we can also contemplate what we're grateful for. Expressing gratitude is shown to have a positive impact on physical and mental health. And mindfulness, as Randy gave us an example of, is a technique that can bring attention to breathing and help calm and ground us. Many youth are finding meditation and mindfulness apps that helps them calm and sleep better at night. At the end of this presentation, we've included lots of great resources with some of these and more ideas. And one example here is a recent webinar that some of my colleagues created with PCMH as well. And lastly, don't forget to laugh and find ways to laugh and have fun together. Finding humor in even bad situations can not only lighten the stress and help us see things from a different perspective, but it can also bind us together and support that sense of belonging that we're all in this together. In my neighborhood, I regularly see these simple cardboard signs on the windows of bad dad jokes. And you remember all those toilet paper jokes last spring. And teens especially tend to appreciate the silly and even the bleak and dark humor in situations. So use that. And back to that point of how flexible thinking is hard for our teens, we recognize that the pandemic has required us all to be flexible, to shift gears, to do things differently. But remember that teens' neurobiology is different, making it harder for them to do this. So how can we help our youth develop their flexibility, to grow their sense of who they are? They'll need opportunities to practice different parts of their identity, both in how they cope with situations and also in how they view themselves. And this is really key. So when a situation does come up where they can't enact that identity, who they thought they were, they aren't lost. They aren't just a hockey player or an art student, but there are a lot of other things too. And they have the ability to be other things that they might not have even thought of yet. And you need practice seeing situations from a different perspective to find those silver linings. Just look what we've managed to do globally and individually. It's really important to notice this and talk about it. Also, we can help our youth focus on what they can control. Help them make a realistic appraisal of the situation and determine what's in their control and what's not. This takes practice and this takes experience. Most of all, let them know that mistakes are a part of life. To have a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. To not be afraid of trying new things or failing and finding out that there's actually part of learning this to make mistakes, and it actually shows courage. I think Meredith has an example as well.
I love this example. One of the teens in the community said that things that have personally helped me is making a list of what I can control versus what I can't, and then reading that over every few days. As well, writing down my wins for the day really helped me because it can feel as though time is just passing us by and we are wasting it, but writing down my wins helped me realize how much I have truly accomplished.
I love that example. Thank you. Another normal developmental stage this pandemic is impacting is that it comes right at a time when teenagers are developing their social independence and social identities. The downside to this can be that as teens turn more to their peers, they may gather more limited information from less experienced peers and can feel a lot of peer pressure simply to gain membership in a group. Also, as adolescence is a time when parents and youth are renegotiating their relationships, youth are naturally pulling away from their family. And it's not atypical to have higher levels of conflict as they push the boundaries of where they can go, how long they can stay out, what they can wear. And now the pandemic has put our kids back in the home and asked parents to manage and instruct their schoolwork and help manage their social lives under constantly changing rules with even tighter restrictions and curfews on their independence. The upside is the teenagers' drive and recognition of the central importance of supportive relationships in their lives. Research has shown us that social connections are key to mental well-being, longevity, and happiness. Research has also shown us that we are hardwired to connect with others. Our development from the very beginning, as shown by some great studies with infants, is that we are inherently social. The myth of independence that much of our culture has placed on us is slowly being replaced by recognizing the value of interdependence and co-regulation. And our teens are driven to find this with each other, and that's a good thing. But the pandemic makes this hard because, as for all of us, opportunities to socialize have been restricted. And those natural activities of just meeting up in class or playing on the same team are limited or not at all, making it harder to reach out and connect, leaving many teens feeling isolated and alone. Younger people tend to be looking to maximize their social connections and connectivity. They're exploring who they are in relation to others through shared interests and clubs to explore what they like to do and who they want to be. Teens also tend to prefer novel social interactions, meeting new people, building a larger social network to practice new identities and ways of being. This might be different for older people who become more selective and undergo a pruning process that leaves them with a more intimate circle of friends and much more suited to pandemic bubbles. I think Angela has an example as well.
Thank you, Susan. I was just going to share I have a teenager who is going to be 18 and will be graduating this year. And when I think about what his journey has been like over the last couple of years, up until last year, he's a very, very social teenager. He loves to spend time with his friends. He goes out many nights a week, other than when he's got maybe school. But we've had to put some restrictions on that. So obviously they have been imposed by lockdown, but additionally, when it comes to looking at kind of his bubble, it's really taken a bit of a toll on what he's used to for going out with his friends, and so we've had to, navigate that with him about understanding the risks that are involved and really the reasons why it's important that he at times not be in a larger group and gathering together kind of with friends. And so we've had to navigate that together. And at times we've even had to put restrictions on him to say, nope, tonight's or not right now, it's not okay. And other times we've had to, quiz him about how many people are there. And so we're talking groups of 5, or we're talking groups of 10. And so it's just a very different world for him. And that's taken a bit of a toll on his social identity. One of the things that we had to do as parents was become a bit more adaptable around his use of technology. So normally as parents, we like to kind of restrict our kids off technology so that they're not getting that too much. We had to loosen up some of what our expectations were around that, because that ended up being his outlet for that social identity development and that opportunity to kind of connect with other people. And so we had to get a little bit more creative. There's more FaceTime. There's doing online gaming with friends and things like that, or maybe just seeing one friend at a time. But yeah, it's definitely been a different type of year for around kind of that social development piece and kind of developing his own identity as a teenager. So yeah, it's been tricky. Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. Those are excellent examples of just how your family is trying to navigate this that I think a lot can relate to. And I think leads us to some of these ideas that we wanted to present as well, because we know, as you say, youth need to be socially connected. Research from how people cope with natural disasters and trauma has discovered this crucial role of human connection and social support. So right now, it is important to recognize being physically safe does mean physical distancing, but being mentally healthy means social connecting. The pandemic experience has laid bare just how important emotional connection with others is for our physical and mental health. When we engage with others, we learn to resonate with their emotions and their perspectives. We learn to empathize and have compassion for their circumstances. When we share our experiences and our feelings within relationships with others, even if it's on Zoom or in what seems like the same old conversations, what we're really doing is constructing meaning of these things together and confirming again that we're not alone and we aren't the only ones feeling this way. So it's important for us as parents to be intentional about connecting with our kids and encouraging them to connect with one another in safe ways, as you shared. An additional challenge to this in many households relates to those differing interpretations of restriction rules and the varying capacities of maybe families to monitor how their kids are following those rules, to be able to sort of do those quizzes and check-ins. As a parent, it's hard enough to be clear and fair about curfews and expectations. And some of us have kids who are highly anxious about the rules, and we find ourselves encouraging them that it's really okay to just meet up safely in the park. And others of us will have kids who just don't think the rules apply to them, or they simply don't remember what they can and can't do. And for our kids, it's hard enough to navigate peer pressures without this additional overlay of COVID rules to follow. As a friend of my daughter said, I don't want to be the COVID police with my friends, so I just sometimes avoid them. So be curious about how your kids are connecting with friends and navigating some of these challenges. Check out what they think of the rules and what they think of how others are handling them. They might have some creative ideas and they'll appreciate being included in the discussion. We've also had to recognize that the majority of interactions, as Angela shared, are likely to be on screen. And this is okay and might be critical to avoid that sense of isolation. This is a tricky one, as for years, we've been told to limit our social media. And now we're faced with a situation where we spend countless hours in front of our screens, and the only way to connect with others might be through our screens. So it's still really important to set those limits, talk about healthy hygiene and balance, and make sure we do this and model this for ourselves as well, which can sometimes be pretty hard. But thankfully, research has begun to show us that although we do need to balance this, the quality of screen time might be more important to consider than the quantity. So isolated screen time until 4 a.m. won't be good. Constantly doing social comparisons on social media where you inevitably come up short also won't be good. But spending the evening chatting, group gaming, checking out YouTubes and TikTok to share later with friends might just be critical to staying connected, which will be important for your teen's well-being. Another really important COVID casualty of kids not being in schools is that schools were often the context where students had access to frontline mental health support. They could walk into guidance and receive frontline support independently and spontaneously. Schools also often the safe space for youth to experiment and learn about alternative identities, example LGBTQ and minority groups, and connecting with others who think the same way they do or have had some of those same questions that they did. For some students, they may not feel safe at home expressing new ideas or exploring an alternative identity. So the loss of these groups in school can leave them feeling isolated. So it is up to us to stay open and help them access the supports and connections they might need without judgment. And lastly, remembering the value of connection to nature. This has for many of us been a silver lining of COVID, in that we've been driven out of our homes in order to connect with others. We weren't able to visit in our homes, but we can walk our dogs together or meet up in the park. And thankfully, as the warmer days have approached and the restrictions have loosened again, we've been able to get out even more and with more of our friends. In past years, we've been aware of the nature deficit many of us and our kids are experiencing. And research shows us that connecting with nature is important for our well-being. Just being outside, maybe even exercising, has been shown to be a pretty easy way to build mental resilience. The third point I want to share is psychology studies have shown that young people have very different developmental goals, and they tend to perceive time differently than adults. Teens might see their time in life expanding ahead of them, so much so that they're often criticized for not thinking ahead and planning for their futures. But researchers have shown that young people do have goals, and they tend to be big, long-term goals that focus on skill and knowledge seeking and identity building. Who they want to be, what job they want, who they want to be with. These are all pretty big goals. The downside of this is that these big ideas can feel pretty emotionally laden and weighty and might feel stressful and might feel hard to achieve at times, sometimes causing youth to engage in avoidant behaviors or lose motivation if they don't know how to get to these goals. This becomes especially hard if they feel the pressure of time, feeling like they have to meet these goals now, without the experience of knowing that they actually have lots of time to figure this stuff out, to get it wrong, and even get another chance. The upside of this is that this can be an exciting time for young people, as they are trying to find out where they're going to fit into the world, where they're going to make their mark, what identity they'll create for themselves. This is the time where they can dream big. Older adults are more likely to have achieved some of their life goals, finding a partner, finding employment. We have the experience to know that we don't have to have it all figured out. We can make mistakes and take detours. We also have the luxury to view time as more limited and precious, so we can focus on emotionally related goals, maybe such as savoring positive moments. And are just more practiced at finding contentment in those little things, rather than always looking for that big life meaning and those identity impacting experiences. But COVID has impacted this for our youth, as those big goals like gaining new skills, looking for jobs, are being thwarted by the school disruptions and hard to find employment. Likewise, teens may have difficulty seeing how this challenge will pass. They may not have the experience to imagine an end to this. And for them, right now does feel like forever. I think Angela has an example again.
Yeah, I know one of the things that we've been dealing with in our house is that given that we're approaching kind of 18 in September, we're graduating. And that's been obviously a huge goal for my son to graduate. And not that necessarily doing all the academic pieces to get there is necessarily always a priority, but because it has definitely been challenging to get kind of that engagement through the course of this past year. But for him, it's a big decision, kind of what he's going to do kind of after school. So whether he's going to go to some kind of post-secondary, whether he's going to, do a trade, whether he wants to work for a year or two. So it's been, those are big goals for him. And his focus is kind of, he really wants to do what he wants to do. And as parents, sometimes we are trying to navigate that with them, and that can be difficult. And so, yeah, it's been very different this past year about how we've navigated that kind of an experience for him, because one of the things we were going to do is we had talked about he had talked about doing co-op in the fall. And so it's been an interesting journey to watch co-op over this past year, because much of that didn't happen, or if any. And so we're not sure what the fall is going to look like, or whether that just means that he'll be looking to, join a college program or something partway through this next year. And so there's just a lot of unknowns. And so navigating that has been trickier, but definitely those big life goals don't go anywhere. They're still really relevant for him. And the timing is important for him, and making money is important. So it's just figuring out how do we do that in a way that still allows him to meet the goals that he wants, but in a practical way, given kind of the circumstances that we're in right now.
Thanks for that, Angela. It's exactly about those questions. So we may need to help our youth feel that they can accomplish those goals, like graduating, co-op, looking ahead, but this might involve some of that flexibility to see new ways to achieve those goals, and maybe a different timeline to do that in. A key to helping them think about this is maybe less about the goals themselves, but really about getting to what is behind this developmental stage, which is their need to feel competent, to feel like they're going to have a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives. Our teens are trying to figure out who they are, how much they're needed, what role they'll play, and are looking for that sense of feeling valued and having a purpose. One of my colleagues often talks about the 3 C's of well-being. 2 are coping and connecting, which we've already talked about. And a third, often forgotten C, is competence. We all need to feel like we're doing okay and that we're of value. I recently listened to Oprah share how every single person she interviews, from Tom Cruise to Barack Obama, turned to her at the end of the interview and asked, "How'd I do? Did I do okay?" We all need this reassurance of our sense of ourselves and our competence. So a few ideas on how we can help our youth gain this sense of meaning and purpose are, as we connect with and validate our kids' feelings about how this is hard and often disappointing, we can also engage them in problem solving. As parents, we know all our preaching and teaching and pleading and bribing is only so effective, or maybe not effective at all. We also know it never works to just take things away from our youth or tell them that they can't do without helping them see what they can do. And they need to be engaged in some of this thinking and problem solving too, and they might just surprise you. One way youth can participate is by learning to value being a helper. Altruism and the ability to have compassion for others is actually innate and promotes a sense of self-worth that's priceless. Being a helper also helps youth get out of their own heads. Teens are naturally self-absorbed as they're trying to figure out all these things and as they're learning who they are. So considering another's perspective and another's need can help them shift from their own worries. So help your youth consider ways to help out someone in the neighborhood or a grandparent, and helps them see the difference they can make in that person's life. It can also help to alleviate that sense of lack of control we mentioned earlier, when we see that our actions can improve our own circumstances and the circumstances of others. Another way we can help is to simply notice and focus on what your kids have done in this past year. And as I mentioned before, helping them pay attention to that, how they coped with the many challenges and the hard things they faced. This will help draw attention to and build that identity again as someone who copes with things. As we noted earlier, Dr. Henley Defoe talks about resilience as recognizing that I can do hard things and I'll be okay. In an article on how to find happiness when you reflect on the past year, these authors from Deakin University noted, when an individual recalls a time that they successfully coped with adversity, a perception or identity of themselves as being able to overcome challenges might be activated. Just through noticing and recalling such self-defining events might increase perceptions of meaning and purpose in life. And this doesn't have to be huge things. It doesn't have to mean you volunteered down at the food bank every day for the past year and a half. It might mean you thought to bring in the garbage of your neighbors. It doesn't have to be big, it can be simple. At the same time as we're encouraging our youth to find purpose and meaning in their activities, we also have to remind our kids that they're enough just as they are. When we learn to accept who we are, even when we're struggling, we're less likely to feel peer pressure. we're less likely to take unnecessary or less safe risks, and we're more likely to stay motivated, even when it's hard. Helping them acknowledge what's cool and amazing about them just as they are, all they've coped with, and all they've learned. Maybe they might feel like they don't have anything to show from this year, but it's the invisible just slogging it through that you can point out that they managed to do. Lastly, helping your kids engage in planning ahead. This might not be great right now, but helping them imagine what can lie ahead for them and beginning some concrete plans toward that. Talk about what they look forward to trying in the future, as this will help shape how they see themselves now. This is all part of feeling hope. Hope that this will end, and also hope that we'll learn and grow from this. I'll pass it over to Meredith for a story.
Here's another teen example from the community. This person said that the biggest thing I've found throughout COVID that I've needed from my parents is understanding. Being a teen, especially one dealing with mental illness, doing daily basic activities has become increasingly difficult and exhausting. We are all doing our best right now, and we need our parents to understand that our best looks different now, and that's okay.
Thanks, Meredith. That's great to hear. So my final reason why our teens might be finding this pandemic hard is that adolescence is naturally a time of risk-taking and novelty-seeking, creativity, and exploration. Neuroscientists again remind us that the reasoning part of the brain isn't fully connected yet to the reward center of the brain. Teens are seeking novelty, and they'll be naturally more impulsive and take risks to get there. This period of pushing for independence and identity is a really important adaptive time for youth. It's during this time that teens can try out and gain those experiences they'll need to take on those adult roles and behaviors, to explore and get feedback, to inform how they can make decisions like, should I take this job or that? Am I too impaired to drive? What do I think about sexuality, about racism, about climate change? This is a time when youth are beginning to find their own ways to think about these really big questions. And sometimes it takes that youthful mind to push adults to be more creative and consider things in a new way. Think the Beatles. And to be less complacent about the environment or racism by speaking out against it. Think Greta Thunberg. The downside of this teen tendency is that they'll make impulsive decisions, and some of these will get them into trouble. Also, this natural drive to not just conform to life as usual can be disorienting and stressful. Being creative might mean taking risks and stepping outside of comfort zones, and might lead to making mistakes and to failures. And the upside is having the courage to leave the familiar, certain, and safe home nest for the potentially unsafe world beyond. From this backdrop of feeling safe and secure, teens can feel confident to try lots of things out for the first time. It also gives them the courage to push against the status quo and imagine how things might be different. But this pandemic makes this hard for several reasons. This mindset might put young people at risk, as they may not relate to what they're hearing about COVID. They might not see themselves as likely to die from it, so they take risks without thinking of harm to themselves or those around them. A link to that is there might be less structure and monitoring of where youth are if they're not in school to help them make safe decisions. Some of these opportunities to explore the world on their own have been limited. Being able to get their driver's license, date, find a job, just popping into the guidance office to talk about next year's courses. None of these things are easy to do right now. And with all the ups and downs of this year, most of us lost that sense of normalcy and predictability, the daily routine and connection with friends and caring others. Because ironically, as much as teens might want to push against those routines, it's the consistency in their lives that allows them to feel grounded and safe and secure enough to think about new possibilities. And along with this has been the loss of rituals, the loss of the last day of school events, graduation, proms, sporting events, recitals, family gatherings, an entire year and going on 2 of lost experiences and markings of time. So our youth need a number of things in order to fulfill this normal drive to take risks and explore new things and be creative. One way we can support this is by helping our teens look for areas in their lives where they can feel some sense of competency and where they can achieve a sense of efficacy and identity. For some youth, schoolwork can provide a context for teens to excel and feel confident. And some youth are coping well with remote learning. But we also know that some of our kids might not be feeling competent as a student right now. They might be feeling disconnected and worried that they'll fall behind. Whether they're seeming to do okay or not, it's important to acknowledge the pressure and the shame they might be feeling. as this can quickly undermine their confidence and the link to their identity of being a student. And then they might go looking elsewhere for that sense of competency. Likewise, as they might be missing some of the very opportunities they might have normally found through their basketball team or their drama club or their part-time job, or simply running into a friend on their walk home, helping your youth find other areas in their life where they can feel competent. This relates to what we're talking about in terms of helping our kids consider different parts of their identity. So being creative and able to look at things in a new way, and maybe finding new places where they can feel good about who they are and what they can do. This might be through learning a new skill or volunteering. But again, remember, it can't be us pushing this. We can inspire and encourage and help them notice the new things they've already been learning or new interests they might have. It can be hard as a parent to balance supporting our teens to explore who they are in the world with their natural need for independence. As we talked about earlier, an important and deceptively easy part of this is to simply be there for our kids and be truly present. But what this teaches our kids is that we will be a safe place to return to. Attachment theory helps us understand how our young toddlers first learn to explore the world from a place of hopefully having that secure base. They first step out from their caregiver's side to explore maybe the other side of the room, but always looking back to make sure their caretaker's still there, watching and ready to respond if they're afraid or maybe if things go wrong. And when they stumble, to resist rushing in to rescue them, which can give them the message they can't do it on their own after all. Well, adolescence is similar, but now your child is stepping a little further away, but they can feel confident and able to safely explore and try out new things when they hopefully feel that sense of a secure base, where there are people believing they can do it, where there are people who will not swoop in to rescue or to judge them when they fail, but who will care for them and let them have a fresh start no matter what. And this doesn't mean having no consequences or expectations, but that the expectations are fair and reasonable, and communicate that your child isn't bad or can't do it on their own, but that I care for you and I believe in you. Sometimes we think our teens don't need us as much, and they don't for those practical, concrete things, but they still do need us for emotional and more existential support. Even if they aren't asking you or talking to you about their concerns or questions, knowing you're available is what's important. Dr. Bruce Perry is a physician and expert on trauma, and he shared that the ability to be curious and explore the world is directly related to feeling safe and settled. And part of feeling safe and grounded is feeling that there's some sense of predictability. Routines and predictability are thrown askew each month, each week during this pandemic. So looking for ways to maintain some sense of normalcy, consistency, and routine is important for balancing school, balancing sleep, eating, exercising, and connecting with others. Nostalgia has been playing a part in how we've wanted to spend our time during COVID, seeking out those old familiar games to share with our kids, like jigsaw puzzles or pulling out the old Lego box, are all things that made us feel safe and think of less stressful times, or at least our recollection of that. We've also come to recognize that part of belonging also comes from the rituals that make up the regular passing of our activities. This might include the grads or the birthdays. It can also include the simple rituals of regularly maybe dropping by the community center on the way home from school or Sunday dinner with grandma. Rituals are less about the events and more about the feelings shared with friends, family, and community that provide that sense of belonging and meaning and provide a marker for young people making that journey into adulthood. These rites of passage help you think about some crucial questions like, what's my purpose? What do I care about? What am I good at? What does the world need from me? And gives us time to reflect on where we came from and where we're going. And crafting this solid sense of identity has huge mental health upsides. So it can be really worth talking as a family about what rituals were missed and how you might wish to mark these passages and experiences. Lastly, youth need, and we all need, to be part of something larger, to feel a sense of common humanity with others. No one is alone in this. As a family, a community, and as a globe, we're all trying to navigate this pandemic and all it has brought our way. This ties into that need for belonging as we recognize we're part of something larger than ourselves. As this quote by Mother Teresa points out, no matter what terrible disease we might be talking about, leprosy, TB, and I think she would even include COVID in this list, a worse condition is the feeling of not belonging, for which these experts in mental health, addictions, and traumatic stress, Gabor Mate and Stephen Porges, point out, the cure is connection. By the way, I don't notice if you've been noticing, but I don't know if you've been noticing, but you may have guessed it, two of my joys in life that help me be resilient are boats and water and dogs. And I just couldn't resist this pair of dogs. I wanted Meredith to just provide a story here too before we sum up.
I love this example. One of the teens said that I think parents need to be reminded that in some areas of our lives, we are the experts. We have it more under control than you think, and sometimes we need to go through our struggles. Why are you so afraid of us struggling?
That's exactly what I'm happy to hear about in youth. Not that they aren't struggling, but what they're able to make out of it. So as a way to summarize, I wanted to return to that idea of resilience. As much as we want to protect our kids from adversity, from worries, from pain, it's a part of life, and it's a necessary part of life too. Research has shown us that when we overprotect, we can all think of the term helicopter parents, we don't allow our children to develop the coping skills they need in life. And we communicate to them that the world is unsafe and that they can't cope with it on their own. As a quote by Linda Graham from her book on rewiring our brain for resilience reminds us, few of us will get through an entire lifetime without being seriously challenged by the pain and suffering inherent in the human condition. The way to respond with skill to such unwelcome challenges is through resilience. So the question turns from how to avoid challenges to how we support our youth to be more resilient and to mitigate risk when they do face challenges. And if we use our original storm analogy, we're aiming to help our teens learn how to sail their ships, even in storms, as captured by this quote. So as our youth face these inevitable challenges and get to the other side, they learn not to be afraid of the next challenge. They learn that they do have the resources within themselves and by reaching out and connecting with others to be okay even when it's hard. I truly believe that although we would never have chosen this pandemic experience to be part of our youth's development, it's here and it's part of their life story now and will be influential in who they are, what they learn about the world and about themselves. And this doesn't have to be negative. And sharing some of these ideas with teens and with parents already, I've come to hear of so many positive stories as Angela and Meredith were able to share as well of how youth and families have been coping. And this isn't to deny their challenges, but to recognize that many youth have been able to show resilience and to demonstrate flexibility and adapting and finding new ways to just be in this time. As a final note and way to summarize, what I hope this helps us think about is how in our interactions with youth, we can help to nurture an environment where they can develop resilience. As I shared, all of these needs we've been talking about are normal developmental needs of our youth. And as I've researched and explored these ideas, what I found so fascinating and exciting is that they map onto the human condition of basic human needs and drives. As writers and thinkers strive to make sense of the challenges and human suffering we face in life through wars, concentration camps, systemic discrimination, and through this current pandemic, they talk about how people struggle to cope and still find meaning and happiness. They might use different words and might frame things differently depending on the context, but they end up talking about these basic human needs that we have for our well-being and particularly for our resilience when unwelcome challenges come our way. Emily Esfahani-Smith is a journalist and studier of psychology and philosophy, and she's written in her book, The Power of Meaning, about these pillars of well-being that get to these basic needs of safety, belonging, and connection, meaning and purpose, and lastly, the idea of hope and transcendence, which we've just been talking about through this presentation. As a final reflection, I recently heard Caleb Dahlgren in a CBC interview discussing in his book, Crossroads. He shared his experience of the Humboldt Broncos bus crash and the aftermath for him and his family. And I was touched by his ability to articulate the impact of the tragedy and also the resilience he's experienced. And I was struck by how many of these basic needs were noted. His need to consider what he can and cannot control. His and his family's need for connection and social support to manage that loss. His need to be flexible, to find another way to enact his identity as a hockey player and how else he might wish to be in the world. His great sense of loss, but balancing that with the immense amount of gratitude he also felt for his own life and for having had the opportunities he had to have known the team members he lost and to have belonged to something so special. His drive to seek meaning and purpose in new ways was critical to his feeling happy. I was touched by the poignancy of how he was able to articulate these basic human needs and instincts, and how acknowledging this helped him to be resilient and his determination to want to share his story with others. As really, that's what we're all doing as a community coming together today, trying to find meaning and to feel hopeful about what this means for our teens and our families. So I thank all of you for having the opportunity to do just that. And before I close, I wanted to let you know what resources and supports we've included here. I won't go over these in detail, but wanted to let you know what's here so you can look at them on your own. If you're concerned or just have questions, here's some community resources and helplines for accessing mental health for your child. These are some great resources, websites, links, and newsletters, many on parenting during a pandemic. And if you're looking for some resources for your youth on coping with anxiety, eating disorders, as well as some mindfulness and self-compassion ideas. And given our time of seeking virtual support, these are some online mental health supports you or your teen might be able to explore on your own. Many of these are specifically designed for youth, but some are for any age group as well. And as we close out our time together, I wanted to share this quote from an educator that encapsulates some of what we as parents might be feeling too, as we struggle to identify what our youth need, as we feel saddened at the losses and hardships they've endured, as we try to balance protecting them from difficulty and encouraging them to learn and grow from these experiences. Deep down, we already have a sense of what students need from us right now. They need us not only to speak our truths, but to listen deeply to theirs. We need to tell our young students through words and actions that they're loved, to make sure they know that while they might have to face some sad and scary parts of the world, they'll never have to face them alone. We may not have all the answers, but we can give our children our care and our presence. So thank you so much for your time, interest, and attention, and all you do to support the youth in your life and yourself. If there are any questions or wonderings or concerns that you have after viewing this, please don't hesitate to reach out to PCMH Waterloo chapter, and they'll be happy to reach out to me if it's something I can answer, or they can offer ideas as well. So thank you for your time.